Hello, everyone. Welcome to the February 20th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. Actually, more relevant to this meeting, I am also the interim governance facilitator, which is why I'm facilitating governance today. Actually, last time I talked about how I say interesting all the time. I'm going to do it again because this is going to be an interesting call. We saw some interesting things happening in the ecosystem this week. Let's talk about those. Essentially what happened was we found that money Legos could potentially turn into money Jengas if left unattended, depending on your perspective, or if your perspective is an outlier, perhaps it turned into money chess, and it was just a finely crafted maneuver, but we'll get into the details of what that implies. To establish some context of the call, though, I would like to talk about, just give a brief history of the GSM. And its long and arduous path towards the governance portal. For the uninitiated, I will give only the briefest of descriptions of what the GSM is. Here's a one-liner. The GSM, the governance security module, is a safeguard that can be placed in the system that will create or impose a delay between decision-making process in the governance ecosystem and the application of that decision into the protocol. Obviously, that's a topical discussion these days, particularly around various philosophies that have been surfacing recently about whether the addition of people into a protocol is a good thing or a bad thing. Opinion seems to be split. I think everybody knows where I stand on the matter. So the idea here is that the GSM has been a core component on the MTD roadmap since the very beginning. It's critical to the health of the ecosystem, we believe, or many people believe, I believe as well. There's some nuances here, and here's the historical aspect of what the GSM is all about. Post-launch, the GSM delay was set to 0. So effectively it was turned off. And the reason it was turned off during the launch of MCD is that we went ahead and launched a brand new protocol, fired it up, and sat back and watched what happened. Obviously, the assumption was it would work great, but nobody can make those kinds of guarantees. And so in order to maintain enough agility, and that's going to be one of the key topics here, is maintain the agility to solve technical problems as they arise or immediately. That delay needs to be set to 0. You can't push a fix to the system for a critical exploit and then hope nobody will exploit that exploit in the 24 hours you've imposed a delay onto the ecosystem. So there was a lot of back and forth. So we had post-launch, we watched the system settle. We were happy to see that there were no large technical faults discovered. And the discussion was raised in the community about maybe now's the time to do the GSM. And so in December, that GSM vote went up, and the mechanisms behind that vote were quite interesting. But I'll talk about that in a second. But essentially what it comes down to is it's a trade-off. It's a decision that the ecosystem needs to make, or our governance ecosystem needs to make. Do we want agility to respond to unforeseen technical challenges, or do we want safeguards to slow down governance capture? And that's essentially what all of this comes down to is what's the greater risk? Failing in the code or failing in the social layer? That conversation has acquired some nuance in light of flash loans in the last couple of weeks. But the community debated this extensively back and forth, which is the greater risk. And as the system matures, the assumption being that in the absence of an exploit, the system will not suffer from one, or the likelihood goes down. But as the system becomes more popular, as secondary lending markets and additional Legos arrive, like flash loans, the possibility for governance capture will increase, and therefore those scales tip. And so that was the thinking in December. We had a vote, and an interesting activity occurred. And this is going to be another theme that I'll be hitting or have been hitting in the past, and I'll be hitting again in the future, is the constant battle between urgency and apathy in our space, or well, in the world, but let's just stick to our space. We as the ecosystem rallied last December to secure the governance executive that was live at the time, to strengthen the system against potential attack. Fantastic amounts of Maker was staked into the current executive in order to protect it against manipulation. Everybody was quite happy with that. The next week, we put in the GSM vote, and it did not pass. And that was a topic of conversation for a few calls afterwards. Why was that the case? Was it because the community chose not to? Was it because the community lost interest and was not able to move enough Maker out of that previously strengthened executive into this new executive that would have secured the system? Or was it because of the Christmas holidays? And well, my vote is on the option number 3. But like many things in the crypto space, we know what people did with crystal clarity, thanks to the beauty of the immutable and public blockchain. We just have no idea why they did it. And so that left us in a bizarre situation where we had a big problem, but people lost interest in that problem. And so we had some discussions about how do we resurface these things. And resurfacing votes is a tough problem as well, because then we have to make some decisions about why that vote didn't pass in the first place. Do we assume that the community sat down and had a reasoned debate amongst themselves and determined that the GSM was not required, therefore the vote failed, and therefore it'd be a waste of time to review it? Or do we assume that there were confounding circumstances and that it needs to be resurfaced? And this is where I want to point out some interesting alignments, because it may feel like we're here talking about this because of flash loans, but we are not. Due to the prescience of LongForWisdom, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. A thread surfaced in the forum 2-3 weeks ago from LongForWisdom saying, essentially, I might be unfairly characterizing it, but hey everybody, how about that GSM thing? let's take a look at that again. And it got a lot of good traction, a lot of good debates. And so we've been talking about the GSM for weeks now. This also aligned, here's some more alignments, with some initiatives internal to the engineering team here, where a plan had been devised to solve that first problem I talked about, where the trade-off of agility versus safety. The agility that's required to push a fix to the system without showing your cards and or being restricted by an artificial delay. That fix is called the dark fix, and I will hand the discussion of what that implies off to somebody after I'm done talking. So that's the second alignment. The third alignment is that over the last week, we've seen the introduction of something called flash loans, which allows people to take very high-risk decisions with a great deal of uncollateralized crypto and perform very complex actions in a single block. And the outcome there, to no surprise, was that somebody found a way to either exploit and or effectively use the crypto Legos that we put together. So those are the 3 interesting alignments, but it kind of brings us to where we're at right now. So we are in a position where the GSM has been resurfaced. It's more timely than ever. There's significant complexities and philosophical aspects that need to be understood before we vote on the GSM. And there's some other there's some technical insights that I'm hoping that the engineering team will be able to walk us through in this call. But I wanted to set the stage. This is what we're talking about. It's been a long road. GSM was here, it went away, now it's back. The ecosystem has evolved, and we need to evolve with it. So this is an analogy I use sometimes, is that the crypto space is sort of an antagonistic space, and that can be good or it can be bad depending on your leanings. I believe that it's good because it requires protocols that exist in this ecosystem to be resilient. And we've been exposed to a new attack vector, and it behooves our community to come up with antibodies. And one of those antibodies, I think, is what we're talking about today with the GSM. Another one is the dark fix. Before I get everybody to tune out of Rich Radio, let me wrap it up here. So here's where I get philosophical a bit, and people can feel free to roll their eyes. But we need to think about some things, not just today. This isn't the urgency versus apathy thing, but for today and next week and the week after until we get some solutions in place. We need to understand what the nature of decentralization looks like for our protocol, whether that involves humans, whether that involves algorithms, or whether that involves a combination of those two things. What are the pros and cons of these things? Do we accept that the ecosystem that we exist in is adversarial, or do we want to demand and or cooperate with other ecosystem actors to set up guardrails? That's going to be a very interesting discussion. How do we handle this battle between weak and strong executives? Presumably, if that last GSM went through, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Why was that executive weak? We need to figure that out. We need to continue to talk about whether continuous approval voting is a solution that is robust for the world, enough for the world that we live in right now. That ties back into more other conversations we've had, and we're going to run into it again this week, where what happens if we're rolling up a pile of polls into a Friday vote and one or more of those polls are contentious? Does that put the system at risk? So we have here's an example, a working example. We have a poll scheduled to be included in the executive tomorrow. The states that we need to raise the debt ceiling in the DAI ecosystem. That's a fairly critical situation. We also have this poll or this vote for the GSM. So what happens if one or both of those things are contentious and the vote doesn't pass? That might not be great. Which ties into the combining of technical and monetary policy decision-making processes that we've been talking about for a while, which will require some discussion. All right, I'm going to leave it there. That's the framing. We have technical or engineering representatives on the call. I believe that
we do.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to potentially hand it off there, or maybe I'll put this up for a vote. Governance in action. We have a lot of GSM stuff to talk about. We have dark fix stuff to talk about. We have flash loan stuff to talk about. We also have the state of the pegs to talk about. Do people think we should just get into the state of the peg, handle monetary policy very quickly, or should we hold that towards the end or skip it? I'm open to any kind of suggestion there.
I feel like the GSM conversation is probably just going to carry on as long as it carries on. So it might be good to get the state of the peg done first.
All right, sounds good to me. So we'll do that, and then we'll loop back to ecosystem activity. So Vishesh, you want to take it away for us?
Sure thing. And I will try not to eat up too much of the time either. All right. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, a couple things to touch on. So overall, total DAI is at 120 million, with DAI from ETH at 115 and DAI from BAT at 1.6 million. So this sort of fluctuated a bit, but did actually take a slight dip as well. So that's something we'll talk about with regards to ETH and what ETH has been up to. But overall, the collateralization ratio went up and then back down, which is another interesting point to mention. So let me just touch on DAI real quick. So currently, just slightly below peg, very large trading volumes, and so, or larger than normal. And the other interesting thing is a huge chunk of that was from DYDX, and so this is actually just something to note that over the past week or so, we've seen actually some rather large DAI ETH trades, specifically on DYDX, and that's kind of understandable given the vast fluctuations in ETH price recently. So here you can also see that as well in sort of the week timescale, where pretty heavy volumes. Interestingly enough, though there have been moments of running up and running down, more or less actually keeping around the peg, which I think is a positive indicator that the system has now experienced a sort of crazy, quote unquote, period in ETH prices with run-ups and sudden drops, and is still sort of returning to peg. So that's actually a positive indicator that the system is working perhaps a bit more efficiently, a bit more robustly than it did in the SCD days. So one other thing to note here was just did another breakdown of collateralization ratios, and I shared some of these numbers on Twitter, but basically a decent chunk, about 65 million of the total DAI supply is, or specifically DAI ETH supply, is 300% collateralized or less, and about 57 or so is 275% collateralized or less. So this is actually interesting because you have basically half the supply at very, very low risk, and then half the supply at sort of mid to high risk. And then the proportion that is in the range that I sort of mathematically consider to be a meaningful risk, which is the sort of 225% collateralization or lower area. That's about 27 million of the DAI ETH supply. So, you know, that's a not insignificant percentage of 115 million. So just something to be aware of is these collateralization ratios. Now, part of the explanation of this was the initial run up in price over the course of, you know, say a week or two. You had a sort of rebalancing and some of this decreased collateral amount, and then, you know, very sudden price drops. Not much in liquidations actually during that time frame, but there has been some sort of speculation as to the reasoning for this, and might have something to do with the large quantities of ETH and MKR that have been moving around, both between Maker and Compound, and we've seen some refinancings there, and then also just with the large quantities of MKR that have been pulled out and the whole conversation around the GSM, there's some speculation that maybe that's people removing some collateral as well, due to just for a short time frame, due to some concerns around security. But again, it's always very difficult to guess as to people's reasonings for moving debt and collateral. So yeah, just sort of over time, we'd seen kind of this dip, you know, sort of a nominal rise in the amount of collateral, and then we saw the ETH price starting to come up a bit, and people were removing some of this collateral, and then sort of in one fell swoop, a few large transactions removing collateral, bringing it down a bit lower. And then similarly, that debt amount was growing and then dipped a bit right in the last 48 hours or so. Let's see if this graph loaded. It hasn't yet. Okay.
Sort of raises the possibility for me to do my favorite thing when you're presenting, is to ask you to predict the future and or the motivations of anonymous people. So here we go. Why do you think that happened, Vishesh? Is that a response to flash loans, or is that somebody restoring their position, or just paying down debt? Do we know what that activity was all about?
So, I mean, this was, like Primoz had tracked this. This was some refinancing to Compound for sure. But as far as reasoning, that's difficult, right? So no, I'm not gonna like try to sit here and guess at people's reasons, but it is coincidental for that to occur right at the same time as there's this big conversation around the GSM and, this MKR governance attack potential. So a little coincidental, I guess, is the best that you'd be able to say, but you can definitely say that it happened.
We can't say that. Do we have, well, I don't want to sidetrack you, but do we know how much MKR is available in secondary lending platforms today?
So, I mean, the main one is Uniswap. So I did also, over the last couple of days, I broke this down a bit in terms of what's the liquidity of MKR in Uniswap. I'll just reload this.
Not to interrupt, but I actually was just working on a script to get all the liquidity of MKR from different platforms. And so right now it's around 13,000, it looks like.
It's fantastic. There's a really interesting behavior there that we should talk about in the call, because more often than not, this ecosystem actually makes me quite happy. You can tell by the smile on my face that people seem to be pulling MKR out of secondary lending platforms, and I'm choosing to interpret that as an attempt to secure the system or the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I recently broke this down at like a transaction level, but what, not to bore people, what happened more or less is there were a few individuals that supplied MKR to Uniswap in the last month or so in the liquidity pools. And then essentially in the last 48 hours, there were two large whales, one of which purchased about 1,000 MKR on Uniswap, sort of draining the liquidity there. And then another user came in and just took out 11.2 million, 11.2 thousand that he was supplying to the Uniswap pool. So net, it fell to about 4.3 thousand MKR, which is dipped like another 0.1 or 2 in the last 24 hours. So in the last week, it more or less went from 16 to about 4. And that sort of coincided, this large removal of liquidity coincided with an 11% price pump day of, which has since come back down about 9%.
It's a fascinating behavior.
Yep. All right, I will stop there.
All right, thanks, Vishesh. If anybody has any specific questions about the PEG, speak now or forever hold your, well, or wait till the end of the call and we can have a Q&A session. But what I would like to do is hand it over to the engineering department, because there's complexities here and implementation details that should be discussed and all the rest. So who's going to pick it up for engineering?
That's going to be me with and rest of the team. Feel free to interrupt me.
I will.
Okay. So let me start by saying, I mean, a few things that I was going to say, Rich already mentioned, Vishesh as well. We've seen liquidity drop in Uniswap. I believe this is a clear case of the community realizing that it's important to protect the system, and because some of them moved it out of Uniswap and into the Chief. Right now, there is around 150,000 MKR protecting the top spell, the hat. So we're at the point where often we've been told that like even the Maker Foundation with the dev fund, which it does not vote with, but even with all of it, it couldn't be able to suppress this. So I think this was a good moment where everybody came together. But okay, let me say that most of what is going to happen, this is not out of chance. This is all part of the roadmap. The delay exists. It is set to 0. We've discussed plenty of times why this. We felt that this was a good idea. We tried to do the vote last year. It didn't pass. And like Rich said, LongForWisdom mentioned, hey, what if we do this again? So one thing that was still in our minds was the fact, and you've all seen this with the BCX exploit last week and this one, they had a delay and they actually removed it so they could fix bugs, right? We've thought about this, and we feel that the dark fix, it's an elegant solution. And this is all in the way to what we call, progressive decentralization, gradual decentralization. The dark fix is a great compromise. This is not the ultimate fix for the future. Right now, MKR is still, it is not as distributed as it could be. So there are still a few whales that can come together and decide outcomes. But it's the best fix we have right now. So in the future, we have emergency shutdown for certain things, and we can shut down the system and we can deploy a new one. Right now, the system is so new that it is not that feasible to do it. But we envision a future when, if anything goes wrong, it's one transaction to shut it down, another couple of transactions to set up a new one, right? Or maybe even have a new system in place and have everybody switch from one to the other. I guess my point is that, these are things that have been discussed for a while, and we continue to do so. And now that this has resurfaced, what is going to happen is tomorrow, we're going to set up a new vote to increase the governance, the GSM, the delay to 24 hours, which is what has been on the roadmap all along. And we're going to give it another go now that, the community and everybody seems to agree that it is a good point that we do so. So I do have one question for the community. Does this qualify as an emergency vote? Does it not? Do we bundle this with whatever came out of this weekly poll? This is my question to the community, and we're open to, I believe there were votes already. So if anybody wants to chime in on this.
In the absence of chiming, I'm going to volunteer. LongForWisdom, a resident governance expert and overall community rock star. What are your feelings here? Because there's ambiguity. I touched on this at the top of the call, where we've had this discussion that we don't want to bundle emergency technical fixes and monetary policy together, that there needs to be some kind of arbitration between the risk team and the technical team to figure out whose emergency is bigger, or the third option is we bundle, right? And this is part of the restraints of us continuous approval voting world that we live in, right? So what would be your initial impression?
So I guess I'll start by sort of describing what we already voted in, which was that, so we voted in saying that emergency technical changes should replace non-emergency monetary policy changes. So the kind of complexity to this, what we voted in, was that someone needs to be able to say, like, what is an emergency and what isn't. And according to the wording of that poll, we said that the foundation dev team would be the arbiter of what was an emergency for technical changes until voted otherwise. And for monetary policy changes, it would be the insurance, Cyrus and gang, again, until voted otherwise. So what that kind of means is that the technical team can say it's an emergency and could then boot the other stuff out of the executive, and not bundle it. But like ultimately, if we were like,
well, and vice versa, presumably, right? Like the risk team can say that like the DAI debt ceiling is absolutely critical. So
yeah, potentially. So based on the fact that the technical team haven't said that so far, if we wanted to not bundle, then we would have to like decide as a community whether that was what we wanted or not. So there's nothing we've said previously that has like committed us one way or the other, I guess. Unless the technical team decide to say that yes, this is an emergency and we should boot out the other stuff.
Yeah, this is where things get so murky for me, because we come up with these we, as in the community, the ecosystem comes up with a series of rules and policies and processes in the forums, and then almost immediately we find an edge case that we had not considered, and or an application that maybe we weren't prepared for. So is there a decision-making process that needs to be put into place here, or like public debate of like whose emergency is bigger? Is there a third option where, is it mandatory that we have to split off technical and monetary? I suppose so, right?
I think in the case that the technical team marks something as an emergency, yes, like that's what we voted for.
Yeah. So in
like-
your opinion, based on like the processes that have been set out, tomorrow is going to be the GSM fix, and that's the only vote in the executive, or the only.
No, on the contrary, I think unless we decide otherwise, it should be bundled, right? Because unless the technical team want to say that it is an emergency, right, which they haven't thus far. Mariano, I don't know what if you guys want to say anything.
I do not think this is an emergency. Like we said often, this requires a lot of coordination, but in fact it requires liquidity, which there's just not there. So no, I would not qualify this as an emergency. And if it is something that can be
liquidity is not
bundled,
there today, though, right? Like the liquidity might be there tomorrow.
There is.
No, of course, but I think we can wait one day and put everything together tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't feel that there's anything contentious in the existing polls, although there was long. Can please be in my short-term memory. I know that there was 5 of them. What? Oh yeah, the minimum bid for surplus options. That could be considered a contentious. I'm sorry. I just want to explore the idea of weak executives versus strong, right? But yeah, I guess it comes down to a go, no go on the emergency decision, right? So does the engineering team believe that this is an emergency technical fix that requires?
So here is the thing, right? It is not an emergency, but if we do not want to, if we don't want this to evolve into an emergency, then we should definitely vote it in this week. And that might sound facetious, but I think it is an important difference, because as Mariano said, an emergency would be, the liquidity is available, or the liquidity is close to being available. I would say that the flash loan situation, it doesn't fundamentally change things. It brings a lot of attention to it, and really we have to operate under the assumption now that whatever MKR is available is already like tied up in a script that is sitting there waiting to attack the system, right? So this is really the assumption that you have to that they have to go with right now, because of the fact that liquidity isn't available, and there was kind of the community moving in the other direction, taking MKR away from the market and so on. That's the reason why currently this isn't an emergency. But if you wait another week, well, chances are you will have an emergency on your hand, right? So you definitely do not want to risk this vote not going through, but it is not an emergency.
Yeah, that's a good that's good nuance, because I was just considering the same thing, is that emergency could represent like a clear existential threat to the system through some technical means, or it could mean that there's an attack vector that could increase or decrease in the future. Is that an emergency? Or there's also a weird decision-making process where declaration of an emergency could imply sort of a lack of faith in the monetary or the ecosystem's ability to differentiate between, or deal with confusion, I suppose, like 3 or 4 or 5 different items in an executive. That's too confusing to people or too risky, and so therefore we need to remove all the options for this one thing that's super important, that's that involves sort of this judicial sort of thinking, which has always been a concern of mine. But I think that that's good. So to ensure that I'm completely clear in the rest of the call is that tomorrow we will be seeing an executive go up with 6 items, the 5 polls and the GSM. Is that true?
Again, unless we figure out a way to like decide otherwise, right? Or we don't have any process for like last minute deciding things really, which is kind of a problem, I guess. But
and this is where I come
one
back
thing at a time.
All of my annoying questions, like, hey, everybody, what does consensus mean, and how long does it take to get there? And
well,
there's no easy
but
answer.
I think this is good. This is gonna, at least we'll have precedent for next time. And yeah, just want to say that just don't take my chill demeanor as not saying that this is important. Of course it is. I don't qualify it as an emergency because we are prepared for this. We have the script. We've tested it. It's just presenting it to the community and having everybody vote on it.
Yeah, I think that's another. It touches on another.
I want to stress that it is important to do it.
Yeah, that a thread that we've been talking about for a long time about the need to temper apathy and urgency and find the appropriate middle ground, but also to effectively communicate issues external to these venues, the chat, the forum, and these calls. So maybe we should, people who are in favor of the GSM and want this executive to pass, call up friends and family. Mention it. No, well, get on Twitter or consider joining discussions and/or I don't know, maybe campaigning. This is something that is going to take active participation. We're going to see this more and more in the future. Is that if people in the ecosystem want the ecosystem to change, it's going to take more than just simply moving MKR. It's hearts and minds, and so things need to be communicated outwardly.
So could I bring up a few things? One, not to be too pedantic, but I know we passed the poll that talked about emergency technical changes having precedent over monetary policy changes. But then I think that was also thrown into the executive, and the executive didn't pass because everyone piled onto the current hat to guard it. So I don't know. We should probably decide whether or not the poll was enough or whether or not we need that executive to pass in order for that to actually be policy. The second thing's also related to that spell, but we can discuss the first one first if you want. So
yeah, well, there's nothing more than I'd love to discuss the enormous mistake I made last week in the most attended governance call we've ever had. So thank you, Chris, for that. I don't want to express my own opinion about this because I think that I'm actually going to call on you again, LongForWisdom, because you're like the representative, I think, in many ways for at least sentiment in the community. You've ingested it all. So here's the context here. I'm not entirely sure it was a mistake. Maybe it was. Maybe it's a bad judgment call. But we have different groupings, numerous groupings that will become more obvious in the future as we become more sophisticated of different types of decisions that we make. We make decisions about principles of the group, and we make decisions about levers that we want to pull in the monetary policy world. We make decisions about people's mandates or create clarity about what their roles might be and how they would evolve in the future. These are just some examples of types of decision-making processes. Oh, yeah, there we go. We make decisions about process. Process is constantly evolving. It's emerging in this ecosystem. In order to ratify those different buckets, we have 2 mechanisms. One is the polling system, which is was originally designed just to collect signals, intent. It's sort of like if it collects enough signal, then it's valid, and then it goes into the executive voting portal, and then it becomes officially ratified by the ecosystem. That's evolved over time, where polls frequently are fine if the decision is about intent or policy or process or mandates for specific actors. If you want to change a parameter in the system, traditionally we use the executive as a way of doing that. So there's been some blurriness there. So maybe I'll just claim that it's ambiguity and not a horrible mistake on my part. Either way, bundling of monetary and technical fixes probably should have stayed as a poll. That poll succeeded. It was bundled up with the executive, and like Chris pointed out, that executive failed. So there you go. I've made the case and provided some context.
I'm happy with that answer
I
too.
want to do a recap.
So I guess before we lose it though, does that mean that we need to do it again, a new poll, and just leave it at a poll, or do we assume that because that poll passed and it was a policy and process thing that it's fine, or do we assume that the water has been so muddied with the executive that it needs to go back?
I think it's just fine. Like the executive has always been used in the past for like parameter changes to the system, right? Or like actual like fundamental changes to the protocol in some way.
Well, not always. I could pull it.
Isn't always?
Yeah. But anyways, it's the side
Okay.
point. So yeah, I think
Generally,
that,
yes, maybe. Yeah, I guess I wasn't expecting it to go in executives, and I would have expected it to just be in once the poll passed. So.
well, why don't we leave? Like, there's also another experiment we could perform, and this has been talked about a lot too, is that we don't actually need everybody to disagree. We just need to find out how many people disagree with a decision. So maybe that could be a solution here. If this turns out that this has created too much confusion for people, they feel that there's ambiguity the system can't support, talk about it in the forums, and then we can revisit. But until such time as that occurs, let's assume that the poll passed. We have it. We have evidence on chain, immutable, now and forever.
Right. So,
Chris, you said you had a second part too.
Sorry, yeah, carry on.
I did have a second part, unless someone wants to interrupt me. Mariano can, because he's my boss. So the second part was also related to that spell. We were setting the single collateral die debt ceiling. And what I wanted to stress is that when we're discussing the GSM delay, we're discussing that delay for multi-collateral die. There is no pause mechanism or delay mechanism out front of single collateral die, which means everyone should be much more aware, we should be more diligent about setting both the debt ceiling in single collateral die and also the debt ceiling for the ilk type that is in multi-collateral die, because that will be, if single collateral die is attacked, in theory, that's sort of a backdoor attack against multi-collateral. So if we really tighten those debt ceilings up, we achieve one monetary pull objective, which is to slowly, deprecate single collateral die. We also achieve the objective of sort of guarding the system against, possibly a flash loan style attack, against single collateral die, which could sort of trickle into multi-collateral die. So
that was going to be my closing topic. So I think I can give it now. So to recap, we're going to be enabling the governance security module with a delay of 1 hour. This is according to the roadmap that we've set out.
Right. So sorry, 1 hour or 24 hours?
24 hours. It is the same one that was voted on. It's not going to be the exact same spell, but it's going to be the same parameters that were discussed ever since before even releasing MCD. And this is a system that was created to guard multi-collateral die. And one of the other things we're going to be doing is adapt the governance in single collateral die to make use of this as well. So we're going to be proposing that hopefully on Monday for people to vote this in. Because like Chris said, we should be protecting single collateral die as well, even though it's right now a much tinier system. We will have a post about this because there needs to be a couple of changes, not many. And we will leave it to the community to decide whether the governance security module should also be protecting single collateral die.
right, thanks.
If I have anything else. Just one last thing. We will also be monitoring tomorrow the hats, the amount of MKR. We'll be discussing probably with relevant stakeholders when they want to move their MKR around to make sure that the hat is always above the highest amount of liquidity available of MKR, in the market. So I think tomorrow is going to be really interesting, and looking forward to it.
It will be interesting. So, Mariano, before you escape, there's a few things that are happening, or engineering type fixes or engineering-led initiatives. Roadmaps are hard, but is there an order of operations here? So, you guys have put up the forum thread for the GSM again. Then there's a dark fix. Then there's this SCD fix you're talking about. Do we know what this cadence is going to look like? When are we going to vote on the dark fix then? Is that next week?
The dark fix is a method. I don't know. So it's not like you vote on something. The dark fix is a way to fix bugs without outright telling somebody what the bug is. I don't understand.
I can talk a little bit about this. It's exactly as Mariano says. Technically speaking, you don't need a vote for the dark fix right now, and the reason is that the system already supports it. So the system supports that you put up a proposal, which will, if it passes, trigger a spell, and then that spell will have the authority to do stuff in the system, right? The reason why dark fix is already supported is because that spell can be anything, including the mechanism that we laid out in the documentation about the dark fix, which is to allow a change given a certain fingerprint or a hash code, right? So this mechanism is already there. Now, the reason why we brought it up and why we wanted to clarify this before activating the GSM is, first of all, to double check, that this method can indeed already work, and second, because we believe it's an important discussion to be had in the community, because there are all these questions about how do we balance the need potentially to trigger emergency shutdown versus the fact that a dark fix does require, as a minimum, trust requirement, as we described it, and what do we prefer in terms of attestation when the moment comes, right? Sure, and so it's important that we have these discussions, but you don't need a vote to put it in the system because the system already supports it.
Sure, but I think I disagree. So we've talked about these buckets of decision-making processes that we have. So there's policy, there's principle, there's process, there's mandates, there's levers, right? So the dark fix in itself essentially can be considered a technical deploy, but it still impacts the way that the ecosystem or the protocol works. It also has implications on a social layer and in the governance layer as well, to figure out for example, who is going to be in that trust layer, and timing around those deploys, communication channels. There's still a significant number of decisions that follow along with that deploy, right? That impact how people are going to be managing the system. Is that not true?
Yeah, technically, operationally speaking, deploying a dark fix is exactly the same as doing any other change in the system. It's just a specific change which doesn't reveal the actual bytecode that will be executed. So when the moment is there, when there is a critical bug that needs to be fixed through a dark fix, and then obviously you will have to to follow that procedure, deploy it to the blockchain, and vote it in. It will be important that we have had that discussion by then, and that we know what the consensus is in the community. And around that, like if we say, well, that it does require a governance poll for that reason, then sure, it requires a vote. I was talking from a technical point of view, strictly speaking, it doesn't.
All right, so there's obviously a distinction that needs to be explored there a bit between, and we talked about this in the initial dark fix call, that there's this elegant sort of intuitive way of, well, maybe not intuitive, the technical fix is there. It's clean and clear and basically simple. The complexity, though, of all of the rest of what that implies, disclosure, trust, security of the system, which actors in the system the community is willing to trust, all those fairly weighty decisions have been pushed up into a social layer. And I still think that that kind of stuff requires an informed debate and a vote, but we can leave it up to the ecosystem to decide.
I can talk briefly as like why I don't think we should vote on the dark fix, if you like.
Well, to be clear though, are you talking about the technical dark fix or all the processes that are associated with the dark fix?
I'm talking about the dark fix as a vehicle for fixing bugs, like without displaying bug code. Like the social layer we need to talk about and like vote on, but like as to whether we should actually use the dark, or like the dev team should actually use the dark fix vehicle, we shouldn't vote on that because, and I'll explain why. So the reason we shouldn't vote on it is because so in the instance where there's a critical exploit, right, there's essentially like 3 options for what we do, right? There's either we emergency shutdown, just because we think it's dangerous to pass a fix or to do something else. We can either use the dark fix, or we can either, I'm gonna say like we can, like I'm not sort of saying we should or ever that it's a good idea, but we can also, like it's also possible for us to deploy the fix with visible bytecode. Now, the reason we shouldn't vote on the dark fix is because the dev team have made it fairly clear that that is a terrible idea, which I agree with, to the point where they probably wouldn't be willing to do it. So of the 3 options that we'd have in that situation, that essentially cuts off white 1. Of the remaining options, emergency shutdown is always available. Like when the dark fix is like deployed and active, like there is still the chance of emergency shutdown. And we can never like rule out the ability of maker holders to trigger emergency shutdown. So that essentially takes another option out of that vote. And then you're basically just left with like using the dark fix, which is like the only option that you'd be voting on. So the reason we shouldn't vote on it is because there's no like options. Like it's essentially use the dark fix.
So just to be clear, are you talking about every time a dark fix comes along, we shouldn't have to vote on it? Or are you saying that the concept of a dark fix?
But either we shouldn't vote on the concept because it's like it's a requirement, right? Like and when it comes up at the individual time, we'll already have a chance to vote on it because it'll be like an executive which we'll vote on.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. But yeah, I still want to plant this flag that there's a significant amount of social coordination and trust coordination that needs to go. It's attendant to that fix. I still think that requires discussion.
Yeah, no, I agree. We need to discuss that and figure out how the social like layer and everything attestations we can trust with. But yeah.
All right.
Thanks
for that, Mariano. Long, should we talk about governance at a glance, or do we want to do the Q&A session? People have been suspiciously quiet. There's what, 60 people in here? Why is nobody asking questions?
So before we move on, I think we should like discuss the polls that passed this week. Like this got suggested in the text thing. So the poll results that would be bundled with the executive, there's like 5 of them, which is real fun. So the first is the debt ceiling adjustment to MCD, which I believe is increasing it from 125 mil to 150 mil. So that would be bundled in. There is the die savings rate spread adjustment, and the winning option was 0, so the spread would change from 0.5% to 0%. That would also.
That's
so go in.
Surprising to me. That's interesting.
Yeah. So the stability fee, it's the die. So the MCD stability fee adjustment came out as 8%, which I believe is the same as it is currently. So I don't think that would require a change. The size stability fee, so the SCD stability fee adjustment, 9.5% one. I can't remember what the current size stability fee is.
So it went up 0.5%, I think.
Went up 0.5%, okay. And the other one was whether we should increase the minimum, so this isn't going to be much to everyone, but whether we should increase the minimum bid increase required for surplus auctions, reduce the minimum bid increase required for surplus auctions to 2% from 3%, which passed. So, I don't think any of those are like terribly controversial, but feel free to interrupt me if someone has strong feelings on any of those things.
I don't have any strong feelings. I think the 2% is going to be interesting. I just urge people with keepers or anybody to just let's monitor the surplus auctions, see if there's any change. This change will mean that maybe keepers are not that incentivized to bid in periods of, and they are going down. So I don't know. I think it's interesting.
I mean, Mariano, there's been like 3 or 4 bidders in there and a couple of smart contracts that make it within. Glad we're changing the percent difference, but they go immediately, and some people bid above the market. That's been happening.
Oh, awesome. No, yeah. I think this is one of the more interesting ones. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
All right, so user Snake Thixor asked in chat, how are the audits for the GSM module coming? I believe the GSM module is already deployed, it's just not active, but maybe someone could confirm.
Yeah, that is correct. Like we said, the governance security module deployed 3 months ago when we deployed MCD. It is just that the parameter is set at 0. What we're going to do is change it like we would change any of the other ones that we mentioned. Instead of putting a 0, we're going to put the amount of seconds in 24 hours. So 80 something thousand. I promise I'll do the calculation before.
Okay, Long, did you want to do governance at a glance this week?
I can do. There's.
I
guess
feel free to opt out. I would be interested in trying to really aggressively encourage some debate here, because these are very weighty issues. Crypto Twitter can't shut up about it. So, and I believe that some of Crypto Twitter is here. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to have an interesting debate. So if people have opinions about the GSM, the dark fix, the nature of humans in post blockchain world, particularly around governance, that'd be an interesting discussion to have. There's lots of really cool things to talk about. Even our vulnerability to flash loans, and whether governance capture is actually a new problem at all, or whether this is just a new coat of paint on an ancient issue.
Are we allowed to jump in with questions? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, that's what I'm begging for right now. This is the Q&A section, so anything. Nothing's off limits.
So I was wondering. So this is the first time I've sat in, but I've listened on a few of these, and I was wondering, in regards to the dark fix, like how do you limit the scope of what the dark fix can impact? And I'm new to the space, so like maybe it's only a subset of the system, and I just don't know about that.
That is a great question. Will or Wouter, you guys want to talk to that?
Yeah. So the current proposal that we have put forward, it limits the dark fix in the sense that the exact change that will be executed, it's not visible on chain, but the fingerprint of that change is hard-coded in the fix. and the trusted parties who would vouch for the dark fix, they would, and this mechanism is up for debate, but for example, they would publish or they would send a transaction to the blockchain saying that they agree with that exact fingerprint, right? So it's limited in the sense that it would only do what these auditors, whatever you want to structure that, but what they would agree to. It is not limited in the sense that the code as it executes would have full, like it would be able to change the full range of things that you can change through any other spell that you would put up as a proposal. That is at least with the current structure of the system. One can think about an update of the system, and this is something that, yeah, I expect to happen probably sooner rather than later. But where you subdivide the system into different regions, for example, different modules, and you have like different authorizations. And then once you have that in place, but that is a bigger change, but once you have that in place, then you can indeed limit, as any other spell, you can limit the dark fix to a particular area of the system or to particular changes or to particular actions. Now, you don't want those permissions to be too specific, because that would have the same effect as just publishing the code, because you're kind of pointing malicious actors in the system to what you want to change, right? If you ask permission to remove the collateral adapter for a collateral type number X, well, then people are going to guess that there is a problem with that particular collateral type, right? So that's kind of the situation around that.
Hi, can you hear me, Rich?
Yes, Andy, how you doing, man?
Good, good. So I have a question and a comment. Comment first. As you know, I'm a big fan of looking back further in the history of the internet and other technical organizations for approaches to governance that they've taken. So I once shared that rough consensus on running code, IETF, RFC with you. And with respect to the dark fix, there's like a really interesting system that the guys at LIGO, which is the laser interferometer lab that measures gravity waves, use. Because like the question here is, you're always going to have issues with people saying, oh, you shouldn't be using this specific auditor or these specific group of maker holders or these trusted devs to audit the dark fix. And perhaps there's like a meta solution to this where like the guys at LIGO, what they do is, because it's always difficult to interpret the data of like whether a gravity wave has passed through or not, they have potentially fake data insertions, and they run through the entire process, and it's only like at the very end, just before the public announcements of finding a gravity wave, that they sort of open an envelope and see whether the data is real or injected. And it might be a consideration to think about having sort of injected but empty dark fixes, because it also like answers, you know, like if this is not an emergency, as Mariano and Wouter have said, then like when the dev team does declare an emergency, the social implications of that are pretty stark as well.
That's
whereas
fascinating. So having fire drills, essentially?
Yeah, yeah, exactly like a fire drill, right? I just like using black holes and gravity waves to illustrate my points, but yes,
Your
exactly.
analogy is better than mine.
And my question based on this, because I was initially leaning towards saying, let's just do the GSM votes tomorrow. But I'd love to understand more about the Psi debt ceiling and the point that was made about like potentially Psi getting attacked and that being a backdoor into a problem on DAI. I'm not sure that I've followed exactly how a Psi vulnerability is a DAI vulnerability, and you know what the potential ramifications are of that.
I would like to know as well, because I caught that and I didn't understand it. Cyrus, are you still available? How can, is it just that, you know, DAI is, well, actually, I'm not going to presume to guess. Do we have any additional insights to how SCD could be exploited to damage MCD?
So is this what along the lines of what Chris was saying earlier?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd actually be interested in hearing Chris's comments first, because I wasn't entirely sure what he's referring to.
Back to you.
Well, so Chris can take it over, or I can mention quickly. The fact is that we have a special adapter for the migration from Psi into DAI. So Psi is really a privileged collateral on MCD. So we have a debt ceiling on MCD for how much Psi can be minted, how much DAI can be minted on that side using Psi. And yeah, if there was an exploit on the single collateral DAI side, enough Psi, for example, could be minted on the multi-collateral DAI side. I think that is really the gist of it.
And then when you migrate the Psi over to MCD, you can, because initially I was thinking the SCD debt ceiling should cover that, right? But if you mint the SCD and then migrate it over, you can just keep doing it up until you hit the debt ceiling of the adapter. Is that why he was suggesting we lower the debt ceiling for the special adapter?
Yeah.
Right, and this was, I mean, so I understand it. So I guess can we clarify how that relates to the concept of the governance attack? So the idea is that because there's no GSM for SCD, then a malicious attacker could kind of just keep cycling through minting more Psi and migrating it over.
Yeah, right up until, you know, the debt ceiling on both sides, right? So they cannot mint more Psi than what the debt ceiling in one says, and they cannot get more Psi into MCD than what that debt ceiling says. Ideally, the debt ceiling should be synchronous. I believe in the executive that I submitted last week. There is no synchronicity there, so it was supposed to lower Psi debt ceiling to 25 million, but there was no counterparty on the MCD side, which I'll take the blame. It was an oversight on my part due to December and all that. From the looks of it, I don't see the vote happening, just because right now everybody's protecting the system, and the vote tomorrow is probably going to take precedence. So I think we should either consider another vote next week on Monday to drop the debt ceiling again. But that's about it.
Having an SCD debt ceiling vote next week sounds sensible.
Cyrus, will your team be presenting another update for SCD?
Can you still hear me? I'm sort of losing connection right now.
We can now.
Yeah, we'll look into it over the weekend, and we'll put a governance poll on Monday, and that's what I was hoping to chat with Chris Mooney and the community in the Rocket chat. I think I was mentioning that in the chat earlier. So yeah, we'll figure it out.
All right. There's interesting discussions flaring up in the side chat. If people have access to a microphone, though, please feel free to ask the questions out loud. We encourage interruptions. And we're all equal participants in the ecosystem, so please don't feel shy if you have a question. Actually, there's probably a few people here that I met at East Denver that I threatened to call on directly. I can't remember who they were. Too many lurkers. All right. There's also an interesting discussion to be had too. Maybe today is not the day for it. I'm not entirely sure, but we've touched on how the dark fix. It's great. The complexities are being moved to the social layer, though, and there's the primary complexity there in my mind is who do we trust, and how do we avoid cognitive and rhetorical fallacies when we discuss the nature of that trust. Is it better to have a wide group or an assorted group of people of trusted actors who can validate the importance of a dark fix? Is it better to hope that the people who are most deeply invested in the ecosystem can be trusted, the maker holders, the largest maker holders themselves? Or are they the largest maker holders because they're highly cognizant of profit motives? And maybe that's not the people you want to trust with this kind of thing. Do we want to trust the old world, the legacy financial system, and maybe find some megacorp auditing team to sign documents and legal agreements that ensure that the information will not leak? Or do we want to empower trusted actors from our own ecosystem and from that perspective? So we have the first camp is trading on profits to secure their own investments. Presumably they will manage the ecosystem in a way that safeguards MKR. The second group is just simply bonded and insured, and their business model is to keep secrets. The third group potentially is our own ecosystem actors, where at that point, the security that they put up for us is reputational in nature. So person X will not leak this information because everybody would be really mean to them afterwards. So there's combinations of those three camps that we might need to figure out. And that's a discussion that has to be had, I think, which is why I want to, or why I think that polling and debates are going to be part of the dark fix rollout. Chris, I'm just going to call out people when they type in the chat. Chris, do you have something you want to say?
Rich, on that, I'm not sure if you had mentioned this, but also how the communication happens between dev teams and large maker holders or whatever signatories are involved. I was wondering about that. If what's the most secure way to communicate if those guys had an idea?
What's an interesting discussion, and there's also turnaround time, and then there's people's politics come along with it too. Like, do we trust Ernst & Young and KPMG? It's my assumption that they charge so much because they are legally obligated to be trustable. But how do we coordinate rapidly? How do we find ecosystem actors that are capable of understanding the issues at hand? And how do we turn that around? Because well, here's another prediction for a discussion we're going to be having very soon. Is 24 hours enough for this to be effective? And how long do we sort of leave the ecosystem exposed, whether that fixes dark or not, while we try to coordinate signatories and validators and auditors and all the rest of it?
And just to clear up a confusion here, it's not, so you wouldn't have 24 hours to organize the attestations. That is prior to that. Once the 24-hour delay kicks in, then all that already happened. They already attested to the dark fix, and then it's just waiting and for the community to either cancel the dark fix, trigger emergency shutdown, or allow it to pass.
Right, yeah, that's good clarification.
I have a question. After the GSM is passed, let's say somehow a malicious proposal does get through and it is flagged, what happens next? What's kind of the response?
So I can see that a little bit. Sorry if there's noise in the background. I have kids at my house. Oh, I don't know if I just dropped. It said my connection's unstable. Anyway, so I wrote up a sort of quick spell that we could cook together that would drop a malicious proposal once the delay is in place. So in theory, that would just be a typical get out the vote campaign where we would throw this spell in, and then just sort of like what happened yesterday, we would try and make it clear across social media, and voting that spell up would allow us to instantly remove a malicious spell from the delay, so from the GSM queue. If there are more questions, let me know.
Could you just, one question I have is, could you just add more MKR to the current hat? So let's say like the current hat is 50K and a malicious proposal comes in with 60K. Could we add 20K MKR to the current hat, or is that not possible? And we have to.
So I would say, so that's the step we take before we fail to prevent a malicious proposal. So obviously if a malicious proposal enters the system, we should all just be aware of it, flag it, because it'll probably sit around for a while. And yes, we can guard against it with the hat. If for some reason someone uses deep liquidity and a flash loan to vote it up and lift it and then schedule it, we would be notified of that, and then we would have 24 hours to mobilize this spell that would drop that malicious action, and that would be a campaign like what we saw yesterday.
So,
and if that fails, emergency shutdown is the only.
Wouldn't it be easier to wouldn't it be easier to campaign to raise MKR to secure the current hat than to issue a cancellation spell, which you'd have to raise the entire MKR?
Yep, that's the first line of defense, and should be a path, any path that we follow to, stop a malicious governance action. But like I said, if it's instantaneous, like a flash loan that actually brings it and lifts it to the hat and manages to get it into the GSM delay queue, then our next defense is to try and stop it. And if we can't stop it and we're getting really close to the line, we're going to need 50,000 maker to trigger emergency shutdown. So.
Right. So I get all it. So I guess what I'm not seeing is like a scenario where the cancellation would ever be used, because if we can't secure the current hat to defend, how could we ever get the necessary MKR for the cancellation as well?
I think it would probably look a lot like if it managed to get up, if it was a quick sort of flash loan type event, they might have just enough to like hit us during a transitionary period, or just to get over like a sort of low water mark. But as you can see, like from getting out the vote, we have like 150,000 maker on the hat right now. That would be the kind of response I would hope that would vote on a spell that would drop a malicious governance action that happened to make it past up into the hat into the queue. So
yeah, there's another reason too, which is that there are large MKR holders who don't feel comfortable having their MKR sitting in the system securing the current hat. So they might decide to just move their MKRs to their cold storage, and then when something happens and they see it as an emergency, they might very easily be persuaded to add their MKR for that particular purpose of canceling the unexpected proposal.
Right, that makes sense. So kind of follow-up question. If we're just canceling though, and those large MKR holders won't be securing the current hat, wouldn't the attackers just attack the system again 24 hours later?
Yes, you would have to make sure that the situation after the cancellation is not exactly the same as before, because then yes, it will happen again.
Sorry, one last question. So does voting for the cancellation spell remove your MKR from the current hat? So like if you wanted to vote for the cancellation, you'd have to unstake yourself from the current hat?
Not if you use the more advanced voting API. I think Nick talked a little bit about that.
So the cancellation spell is in that respect, isn't different than any other spell. So you have the very general choice there. So through our current voting API, current voting UI, you would indeed be moving your votes to that spell and then removing those votes from the current hat. If we have the more advanced voting mechanism in the UI, or you would use it through another channel, then you can vote on both proposals, so the old hat and the cancellation spell at the same time.
And if the cancellation spell does go through, the system just stays on the current hat, right? It's not like a new state of the system.
It is a new state of the system, so every action that you execute is a new hat.
Exactly. The spell to remove the previous spell from the schedule would be the hat. Like, you would be voting for that.
Yeah, I was about to chime in here and say that if you're assuming a malicious or potentially malicious spell has been plotted, that means at some point you had a malicious hat, and you would want to get off of that anyway and go into a non-malicious hat that, say, unplotted that new spell.
Yeah, a caveat here I realized when writing this was that while that malicious spell has the hat, it presumably can plot any number of additional things. So you definitely want to remove it from being the hat.
All right. Well, everybody knows how much
it's...
I enjoy the silences. Sorry, Wouter, did you want to? I was going to recap some
Yeah.
conversations inside. Did you want to add something?
Just one last comment. I'm happy that the concept of the fire drill came up. While I agree with the concerns for using a fire drill system to apply it to the dark fixes, I think it should definitely be applied to other mechanisms that we are supposed to use only in emergency situations. First and foremost, that applies to emergency shutdown. Not in the same way as you trigger it on mainnet, obviously, but we need to do drills with our integration partners and make sure that they are prepared for emergency shutdown. The same thing goes for the cancellation process and so on. So these very rare events, they should be practiced in advance, exactly because they are so rare. And yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to work more around this and make sure that we explore these extreme states of the system a lot better than we have explored them until today, and that we through that mechanism also start understanding these systems a lot better.
Can we talk?
You're cutting us, Sarah.
All right. Yeah, poor connection. Can we talk a little bit about the expectation on who's going to be monitoring for malicious proposals? Is that something that the foundation is doing, or is there an expectation that the community build some public resources, or is it, I'm not sure. I mean, I feel like I know the answer, but I don't feel that maybe others have been thinking about this.
This would be part of the gradual decentralization roadmap. So today we have the foundation monitoring and have alert people when there is something fishy going on. But that is just one of these functions that we need to push out to the community as well. And the way to do it, I believe, is to make sure that this monitoring and alerting infrastructure is easily available with a very low barriers to entry, so that anyone who is concerned about this risk can set up an instance of themselves and be alerted when when stuff happens on the system that requires further inspection.
All right. Well, that's a cool point. There's mechanisms in the Maker ecosystem that facilitate and encourage the development of tooling for the ecosystem as well. So there's a grants program. If somebody on the call is interested and/or knows somebody else who can throw some code at this problem of monitoring governance for, well, any kind of governance tooling we're interested in, but also for monitoring of unusual events and figuring out ways to broadcast it, I'd be interested in hearing about it. So please reach out to me. In the sidebar, I'm going to recap some of the interesting conversations and some of the things that have happened and see if that leads to any other chats. It's a weighty call, so I could go longer than our traditional 30-minute Q&A if there's interest, but Crypto Wanderer points out or mentions that concerns around triggering emergency shutdown when doing a potential fire drill. I just want to clarify, Andy, that the foundation does not utilize their stacks to repair and or vote against activities in the ecosystem. The MKR that the foundation possesses is non-voting for fairly significant and important reasons. I think that we might find that confidence in the ecosystem, among many other knock-on effects, would be significantly damaged if that was to be the case. Richard Lopez mentioned, oh yeah, this also ties back to what I just said though. So some kind of a dark fix monitoring dashboard or tooling would be an interesting idea. I'm not sure how that would happen technically, but that's not my job to do it. So if the community wants to think about how to monitor for pending dark fixes and figure out if there's a way that could facilitate implementation and or broadcasting that there's an issue at hand, that'd be useful. Did anybody else have any last thoughts or any other comments that they made in the sidebar that they feel didn't get addressed?
Yeah, I can shout out that last comment, which both has different Rich. Yeah, just as there's like kind of a governance monitoring, I think just having diagnostics just to know after the fact would be helpful, but it wouldn't mean, it would have to be lagged just so you can let the devs kind of do their work and do it quickly without, you know, having any drag. I'm not sure like if we should also put in or weight it by like severity of each bug, but you know, just kind of expand around that concept so devs know that they could still do their work and community members can know that, you know, they at least that a lot of stuff isn't happening in the background without them kind of learning about it. That's the general idea.
Yeah, there's tremendous value outside of just facilitating the dark fix mechanism while it happens. There's tremendous value in maintaining a historical record of things that have happened in the governance ecosystem. So I love the idea. For example, every one of these calls is exhaustively summarized and posted in a bunch of different locations, because having that long tail about what happened when has some significant cultural and technical benefits. We also have MakerGov is MakerGov.science is another example of that kind of tooling, which potentially could be augmented to include some of those features that you were mentioning. Just want to throw it out there. It's a community effort. People feel that they have improvements or additions that could be added to that site. Please let us know. All right, do we have any other questions that people want to toss out there? Any last minute? Diagnostics, is somebody better be registering that domain right now before I get off this call, so I'll do it. All right, well then maybe we'll leave it there. Thanks everybody for joining. This was a great call for the newcomers. This is an example of what we've been doing every week for the last 70 odd weeks. There's a lot to go over. A lot of really interesting things are happening. We have a sort of this grand experiment in the crypto space right now with governance in action and open source governance and emergent process and all kinds of tasty memes that I've been dropping hither and thon. Please join us in the forums. We have a vibrant community there that are making significant decisions that are shaping the course of the DAO and creating the protocol in real time. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, you have something to contribute, please join us in forum.makerdao.com and join us in Rocket Chat. We talk about these things all day long. So, there's opportunities to get involved and opportunities to be rewarded for being involved. So come talk to us. And why not? Let's leave with this final reminder. Please vote. If you don't have enough Maker to vote, you're wrong. You do. Vote anyways. We'll get into that right now. And also, if you feel strongly about which way the vote tomorrow should go, please let people know about that. Chat about it in crypto Twitters. All right, thanks everybody. I'll talk to you all next week.